pass over to Dave and Rob.
Thank you. Thank you. I was here a couple of years ago down in Bournemouth doing some paddling on the beach, so it's a slightly different environment today. Delighted to be here. Robert Stone and myself, we both work for Global Data, which some of you may know better as cable in the old days. Government computing is like the free-to-air bit of Global Data public sector. I'm going to look at the broader public sector and some of the sort of themes that I'm seeing, and then Robert is going to drill down further into the higher education sector. So I've called this Uncertain Times. Britain's public sector struggles with a Black Swan scale hangover. There's not much doubt what the biggest backdrop is. Brexit has dominated government and civil service departmental thinking since last year's general election, really. The twists and turns, the perceived feet dragging of the civil service, to the Brexiteers at least, has become a regular feature of the news agenda. The lack of clarity of the government's position regarding Brexit has left many departments equally unclear of what policy changes may emerge and what that means from an IT systems point of view. I think it's worrying to hear such a reliance on technology being the solution to some of the customs problems in Ireland. There's no political solution worthy of the name, but the government is using technology, in inverted commas, as a crutch, largely because of its own failings. You may be familiar with the Black Swan thinking. Some of you who've looked at IT projects over the last sort of 5 or 10 years may recall a SAID business school work around IT projects and Black Swans. Many of you probably have read this book, The Black Swan, by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. It's a great read. Interestingly, he's got a new book out. It came out at the end of February. It's called Skin in the Game. It's all about the risks you're prepared to take when you do and don't have skin in the game. If you look him up on Twitter, you'll see he's had some fun sparring with reviewers over the book over the last couple of weeks. So certainly an interesting character. So what's a Black Swan event? Well, it's an outlier. It's something that's outside our realm of regular expectations. It's the surprise that we really didn't see coming. And largely because of that and because of the cataclysmic effect, it has an extreme impact. Human nature then makes us try and concoct, I think is the word, explanations for what actually happened and what the impact is after the event, and trying to make it explainable and predictable. So what would be some typical examples? Well, I guess the most obvious one is 9/11. That was almost as cataclysmic as you could imagine and was such a shock. Then there's the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. You can have an extreme impact and it can creep up on you, and I guess we could say that about the internet. Largely positive, largely. World War II is another one, and particularly from a UK point of view perhaps now, Brexit. So a quick skate through some of the other sort of areas that I cover on a regular basis, and I'll look at the central government first of all, and the big challenge here I think is the one facing HMRC, largely as a result of Brexit. It's one of those government departments that's most at risk from Brexit. HMRC was on track to replace the customs handling of import and export freight chief system, which is usually regarded as, in inverted commas, venerable. HMRC was on track to deliver that quite effectively, I think, and now it has a challenging deadline of 29th of March 2019. Earlier this year it announced that it was going to go through a phased handling of CDS from August, with all declarations then taking place on CDS from early 2019. Now, HMRC is under the gun on this, and Whitehall doesn't have a great track record of delivering on IT projects, as many of you will know. So it would be easy for me to be sceptical and say this is going to be a struggle for HMRC to deliver. But having met Jackie Wright, who is the new Chief Digital Information Officer, I have a hunch, and it's no more than a hunch, that I think HMRC might, given a fair wind and some foundations from the government, be able to deliver. A year is a long time in politics, and February last year we had the transformation strategy that was announced, and I think it's fair to sum up progress on that as rather patchy. Anyone know who this chap is? You might recall him in politics from this time last year. He's former Minister of the Cabinet Office, Ben Gummer. He's not been seen since the general election because he lost his Ipswich seat, and it was he who led the publication of the transformation strategy, which was launched at the Reform think tank. You could say that the overall effect of the transformation strategy is that it's rather been out of sight, out of mind. It's rather been put in the shade by other strategies, notably the industrial one. So this looks at designs and develops and delivers joined up end-to-end services through government, establishes a whole of government transformation approach, removes barriers to effective data sharing, grows the digital data and technology profession, and also then tries to grow gov.uk Verify, the identity assurance solution, and appoint a chief data officer. The Government Digital Service leader, Kevin Kennington, produced a blog the other week, and he talked about making great progress, building a lot, delivering a lot, and collaborating a lot. He said, we have a great platform to build on. So far, more than 22.3 million notifications have been sent through gov.uk Verify, and more than £39.3 million in payments has gone through gov.uk Pay. But there was no references on the Verify numbers, and you do wonder why someone in government decided to hitch the Verify wagon to the 25 million number. So there's no noticeable progress on the Chief Data Officer, and that may well be a part of a tug of war that's going on between the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport and the Cabinet Office. So we watch that and see what happens. Very closely allied to that is what's happening with the Government Digital Service. A few years ago, GDS was very visible, had strong Cabinet Office support from Francis Maud. Mike Bracken was very, very visible. The fact that GDS is so quiet, I think, is rather a summary of the fact that there's a lack of interest at the top of government in digital transformation, probably because of Brexit. You never hear Theresa May or Philip Hammond ever talk about digital transformation. Some departments are doing some interesting work. The Food Standards Agency is doing some really interesting work around Project Evolve, and it's just built a sort of, not so much a new intranet, but a digital workplace, which I think is really interesting. There's no great strong support for GDS in the Cabinet Office. David Lidington, the Cabinet Office Minister, is very much focused on Brexit, which is why Oliver Dowden, the junior minister, is the person who now has responsibility for GDS. His first couple of days in the job, he was having to deal with Carillion and having to get his way through a Newsnight interview on Carillion, which he did just about. Meanwhile, Matt Hancock, who is now Culture Secretary, having come from the Cabinet Office not so long ago, is very much beginning to make plenty of noise around digital policy. There's a good chance that data policy and governance will go to DCMS. You could say if data policy and governance goes, well, should identity policy go as well? That said, the Cabinet Office Permanent Secretary, John Manzoni, put a blog out at the beginning of this week talking about GDS's role in transformation, and there's going to be a new Sprint conference in early May. So maybe GDS is waking up from its slumber. I mentioned the other strategies are available, and very much one would be the industrial strategy. If the transformation strategy is the wayward younger brother, then the industrial strategy is the blue-eyed boy or girl. There's lots of shiny tech and innovation we can big up, but I'll come back to innovation a little bit later on. We certainly bigged up AI at Davos. Theresa May was talking about it. There's plenty of talk of data protection legislation there and data ethics as well. But it's easy for the government to, it seems, adopt a cut and paste approach to AI. AI washing, I think I'm beginning to call it. Last week, Transport Secretary Chris Grayling was talking in terms of AI helping to lead a maritime technology revolution, plotting more efficient routes, avoiding severe weather, highlighting disruption at ports, and diagnosing mechanical problems. It did feel like adding AI to what he wanted to talk about. Procurement is a very big issue. There is going to be quite a lot of talk over the next couple of years about the amount of work and opportunities that go through the wider public sector from a procurement point of view, particularly around G-Cloud. The government remains focused on talking the talk about giving opportunities to SMEs, but sometimes its actions don't really meet its words. There was a lot of research and indignation at the weekend as to whether the SME figures were actually matched what the government was really saying. There is very much a big push to get the wider public sector to use G-Cloud and CCS frameworks just the way central government is using them. But many people are not aware of government frameworks. I came across one successful organisation in Reading the other week which is selling into the US defence marketplace. It was just not aware of some of the frameworks. And some of the CCS frameworks, the pipeline for them is not as well curated as it should be. It's pretty haphazard for SMEs to understand how much resources they've got to put into that. And one other thing that came out yesterday, some of you may have seen, was that there's now going to be a new G-Cloud framework coming out, G-Cloud 10. Procurement for that is going to start in April, and there is a hope that it's going to be live by June. Another big issue coming up is GDPR. 2.5 months away to the introduction of GDPR. It's clear that many organisations are not going to be ready. I'm sure you'll have plenty of talk the next couple of days about GDPR here. I did have a conversation with one local government CIO in South London the other week, and I was impressed that he seemed to be so ready and unfazed by it. Others, as you'll see in my next slide, are not quite so ready. But it's not just us. I was talking to someone from the International Association of Privacy Professionals last week, and he'd been to a presentation where he'd heard that the Belgian Data Protection Registrar themselves isn't ready for GDPR. This is a story that we picked up a few weeks ago. This is about the Ministry of Justice putting 200k aside for a task force to help assess its IT estate for GDPR compliance. Starting early April, that's 8 weeks before GDPR comes into force, and it's a 17 to 20 week project. I wonder how many other departments across Whitehall are in the same boat. That's right. So I mentioned the digital marketplace. There's the consumption of professional services on the digital marketplace rather dwarfs other spend. It was £0.9 billion in 2017. It was up 40% in a year. That's got to be provided for from a professional services marketplace. It's equivalent to 10,000 FTEs almost in 2018. But where will those people come from? There'll be lots of competition for them. Will there be the resources to deliver that throughput that's going to go to 2.5 billion for 2019, much of which, of course, is going to come through the wider public sector. Moving on to local government, struggling very much for funding. Digital transformation is high on its agenda if it has the money for digital transformation. I think the recent problems with Carillion and the question marks over capita have thrown strong focus onto outsourcing. I think over the next sort of couple of years you'll see that it's a reasonable bet that the public-private partnerships outsourcing story is going to get the same treatment within government that digital government and SIs got over the last 4 or 5 years with the sort of growth of GDS. I think the collapse of Carillion has very much seen to that. And there's a fair chance that this year's May local election will see several Tory administrations turfed out. So there are big question marks, for example, over Barnet Council, very much a capita jewel in the crown as to what happens there. We've heard quite a bit about AI in the last sort of presentation earlier on, and I've mentioned it a couple of times. There are several local councils testing AI, Enfield, Hackney and Croydon, among others. And one of Robert and my colleagues, Alan Moe from Global Data, is doing quite a bit of survey work all around RPA and AI. So if you're interested in some of that area, do talk to us afterwards and we can put you in touch. Another area that local government is very much talking about is data analytics. You've got some offices of data analytics being set up. Essex, Worcestershire are the ones that spring to mind. And one other thing, IoT. I was speaking to Jeff Connell, who some of you may know, who is the CIO at Norfolk County Council, and he was talking about how difficult it is from his point of view trying to get to grips with IoT from a social care point of view and seeing whether they're actually joined up solutions. There are solutions, but are they joined up solutions, end-to-end solutions that can be used? You may know this chap. He's Theo Blackwell, who is the Chief Digital Officer for London. There were some question marks over whether he'd sort of start to face some issues with local digital politics when he took on the job. But I think the interesting stuff there is that London's holding an unconference in April, which will inform the new Smart London plan to be launched by Sadiq Khan at London Tech Week in June. If you're not familiar with the unconference idea, there's no particular agenda for the day. You go and pitch your way through the day. GovCamp is a good example of that, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with this particular conference. Emergency services. A lot of stuff going on from a police sort of point of view. If you're not familiar with the emergency services network, I'll talk about that sort of coming up. Cloud data storage issues for body-worn video. Many police forces are starting to get to grips with digital transformation. West Midlands Police is doing quite a lot with Accenture. And there's some pretty meaty procurements in train too. The one that I'm most interested in is the Metropolitan Police's integrated policing solution, which is now down to the last three, Niche, Northgate and Capita. Whoever wins that beauty contest will have some serious bragging rights. It will replace the outdated standalone core operational systems such as investigations, intelligence, custody and prosecutions. And there are sort of the issues that you probably will be familiar about police IT budgets supporting old systems with little funding available to invest in new technology. And when you do introduce the new technology, particularly amongst the forces, they're all incompatible on a national level, and so you get poor data sharing. Police are also having to try and get to grips with cybercrime. There's very much a feeling among business that police will not look at their after their commercial interests, and they don't really have the capacity to investigate, so they're not reporting it to them. The Emergency Services Network, this is a particularly interesting project. It's not quite on the state of universal credit yet, but it's not far off. The project is 9 months to a year behind schedule. It's technically challenging, it's largely untested, the standards aren't in place, and it will require buy-in from rank and file officers because it's their safety on the job and ours too that's at stake in using it. The issue is the timescale. It's been brought in far too quickly. It was supposed to be going live in various different regions starting from last autumn. Then it was going to be June this summer. Now the Home Office is doing another review which will report in July. Then there will be a National Audit Office report on the back of it. So this thing is largely going to be a long way behind schedule. There was a Public Accounts Committee hearing last week where it emerged that the Home Office was beginning to think about doing stuff from an agile basis because it had forces saying we'd actually like to get the data rather than wait for the voice and data. So the project will need very much a bit of a reset. Healthcare and the NHS. Cybersecurity, it'll be 10 months just about now, almost a year since WannaCry. NHS Digital has gone out for a procurement for a security operations partner to deliver enhanced cybersecurity. I think that's an interesting area. The budget for that instantly went from 20 million to 30 million very quickly, and that will beef up NHS Digital's cybersecurity capabilities. NHS Digital's also announced plans that will see NHS staff being better able to communicate and collaborate with each other through better integrated systems. The plans will eventually see users being able to log into a range of applications and services integrated with Microsoft's Azure Active Directory using their NHS Mail credentials. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. So I mentioned innovation earlier on. Innovation is great, the government says. In fact, the government talks about it an awful lot. But look at this slide. You can see how innovative we actually are. The league table rather suggests that we're 17th on this list, not top 5, not top 10. Even the US isn't in the top 10. The people at the top are South Korea, Sweden, Singapore, and we're 17th behind those European nations that we might look down our nose upon from an innovation point of view, places like Austria, Belgium, and the Netherlands. I mentioned the Black Swan book. There was a quote in here that I really liked. I don't know whether you will get a clue from that as to who it might have been. If you think about the C and Rex, that might be a bit of a clue. If I give you this name, will you be any the wiser? But the clue might be the date. Particularly in Oscars week, you might get a clue about a Oscar-winning film of a few years ago. So he was the captain of the Titanic, and he came up with this idea that, of course, you know, I've never been wrecked at sea, so he faced his own black swan in the shape of an iceberg. But not all black swans are necessarily instantaneous surprises. Sometimes you get positive black swans that take time to show their effect, and while the negative ones tend to happen very quickly, the more positive ones take time to build. So books that sell large amounts over a period of time, or technologies that creep up on us slowly but surely have a positive story. So some details about me there. I have an interesting clicker here. And I'm now going to hand over to Robert to talk about the higher education sector. So I'm his warm-up act. He'll tell you the really interesting stuff.
Thanks, David. And thank you for that lovely introduction. Obviously, just to reiterate, I'm Rob Stoneman. I'm Global Data's Analyst for Education. I've worked in several roles across education, including as a lecturer while completing my PhD a few years ago, and as a data manager in a multi-academy trust for a couple of years. Following on from looking at the wider public sector then, I'd want to drill down and look at some of the key issues that are affecting UK higher education specifically. I'll say a little bit about education at the beginning, but obviously want to try and keep that focus very much on higher education. You'll see there some of the worrying headlines that we're having to deal with at the moment, and in many ways this last year has felt like something of a annus horribilis, I should say, sorry, for UK higher education. And like I said, these are just a small selection from recent months. Universities seem to be under ever greater scrutiny, and it seems that what for many years is one of the UK's greatest assets is frequently being challenged in the wider political discourse. Now these are just a few of the things I'm going to be talking about today. I'll try to steer clear of some of the things that David has already spoken about. But you'll see several of things there that have been in the news very recently, whether that's the creation of the Office for Students, variable tuition fees, strikes over pensions, ongoing strikes over pensions, controversies surrounding excessive Vice-Chancellor's pay, or the future status of foreign students post-Brexit. It's going to be impossible to cover everything, but I'll try and look at most of the issues, and obviously anything that I can't get through we can speak about afterwards. More than happy to field any questions as well. So starting with UK education and the wider public sector, In 2015-16, UK education institutions, that's all publicly funded universities, colleges and schools, spent £2.9 billion on IT goods and services. That represents around 15% of total spend across the public sector. So, I mean, in terms of looking forward to the next few years, we don't anticipate that this is going to drastically change. Our latest forecast predicts relatively flat growth for education over the coming years. And if we drill down, we'll see that universities are responsible for around 40% of this spend, so that's about 1.2 billion in 2015-16. So this is just shy of the total amount for schools, but obviously spending is far more concentrated at just around 160 institutions compared to the nearly 30,000 schools and something like 350 colleges across the UK. Unlike education as a whole, we predict that universities will spend slightly more in cash terms over the coming years. So it's a slightly more positive forecast. Only amounts to around a 1% cash terms rise. So in real terms, it probably will remain relatively flat. But in many ways, it's a far healthier outlook than compared to schools and colleges. But what I think these figures do demonstrate is the true size and scope of higher education IT spending. As an example, universities alone spend more on IT than all emergency services organisations combined. So on average that works out to around £8 million per institution, although obviously this varies considerably between large members of, say, the Russell Group and smaller, more teaching-focused universities around the rest of the country. So I guess in terms of sort of issues to think about, the area I want to start looking at is the marketisation of higher education. From an IT perspective, UK higher education seems to be in relatively good health, especially as I've mentioned when compared to schools and colleges. However, this masks the fact that the sector is undergoing a rapid transformation and one that's going to significantly impact these IT spending that I've just spoken about and the priorities I'll mention slightly later on. Generally, universities have had to weather austerity like the rest of the public sector, but they've managed to do so quite well, mainly because of the fact that the responsibility for funding student tuition has shifted away from the taxpayer and onto students themselves, especially once £9,000 tuition fees coming for the first time in 2012. And as you can see from the graphic there, since 2012, the proportion of university funding coming from tuition fees, coloured dark purple at the bottom, has significantly increased and by 2015-16 accounted for around 45% of total higher education funding. Quite significant as well is the fact that 2015-16 saw the abolition of the cap on student numbers. So this obviously means that universities for the first time are able to recruit as many students as they want. And although in many respects this has been quite a positive move, it's helped increase access to higher education for young people and allowed popular providers to expand. It's meant that there's greater pressure than ever before on the need to try and attract students. No longer can an rival institution simply rely on the fact that its competitors are going to have that cap and that they can try and scoop up those additional students that are unable to get into their first choice. A result of all this is that the government have repeatedly argued that students should now be seen as consumers of higher education. And even just recently, the new Universities Minister recently argued that the days when students venerated institutions and were thankful to win places are gone, and that universities are now in the age of the students. Similar words have come from the new Education Secretary, Damien Hines, who argued that students possess rights as consumers and should be entitled to compensation if alternative arrangements can't be made, and obviously that's in relation to the recent ongoing strike action. Now, whether students or not, actually view themselves as consumers or not is difficult to measure, and there's actually a lot of debate about that, and personally I don't think I'm particularly convinced by any of the statistics that are sometimes put out to back that up. But either way, whether or not they see themselves as consumers is not really the point. In many respects, it's government and universities which are leading the charge in actually treating them as consumers. And as a result, higher education has become arguably more marketised than at any point in its history. And obviously going back to that point about the student cap, this has not really been a choice, it's something that universities are having to do to survive. What is clear though is that students do have higher expectations than ever before of what they get in return for such higher fees. Currently the average three-year undergraduate will have around £50,000 of student debt upon graduation. As a result, fewer students believe that their university offers value for money than ever before. And I think the most recent figures said something like 34% of students believe that their university course offered poor or very poor value for money. And that's double the amount in 2012. So that's obviously going to be quite concerning to everyone in the room and to universities more generally. Added to this are concerns over the collapse in part-time numbers, which have fallen by something like 50% in about the last 6 or 7 years. And this is quite concerning considering that the future ability of universities to meet a rapidly changing workforce will necessitate regular retraining. And obviously if the part-time courses aren't there and the demand isn't there, then this is obviously going to be a big problem, particularly as well for growth. So taken together, these concerns have led universities to prioritise resources on what you'll all be aware has been termed the student experience, be that increased spending on new facilities, equipment and IT services. So focusing on the latter, there's been a clear focus on upgrading hardware, front office student information systems, VLEs, as well as the rationalisation of back office, finance, HR, payroll and reporting tools. And it will come as no surprise then that our latest forecast shows that application spend will be one of the largest areas of growth for university IT spending over the coming years, with a compound annual growth rate of around 2.5%. So this is one of the largest areas across the whole of our forecast for universities and education as a whole. Oh. There we are. So the shifting power dynamic between students and universities is also reflected by the government's continued desire to improve accountability. Since 1986, universities have had to demonstrate that taxpayers receive value for money in their investment in research, obviously the most recent exercise being the 2014 Research Excellence Framework a few years back. Now the same questions are being asked around teaching quality, and obviously the result of that has been the Teaching Excellence Framework, now rebranded the Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes Framework, which obviously aims to reward good practice and guide student choices by ranking institutions from bronze to gold, depending on teaching quality. And you'll see there the results of that last exercise, and that's just for higher education institutions, but for the full results you will have all providers of higher education, including further education colleges. But its introduction has been far from uncontroversial. There's been complaints that the metrics bear little direct applicability to teaching standards, most notably because of the inclusion of student satisfaction results sourced from the National Student Survey. I think feathers have also somewhat been ruffled due to the fact that several leading universities have failed to secure a gold or silver award, leading those who were unlucky to claim that effectively the whole exercise was flawed and that certain institutions were able to game the system, which is also a frequent criticism of the ref for that matter. Now, if two frameworks aren't enough, the government have also announced plans for another one, the Knowledge Exchange Framework. And this is obviously part of the recently announced industrial strategy. As the name suggests, this would aim to measure how research is commercialised and foster stronger links between universities, local businesses and communities. Now, at the moment, there's very few firm details on this, but at present, a steering group has been established, so we would expect some more details about this later this year. So, alongside these new metrics, universities are also having to adapt to a rapidly changing regulatory environment, most notably the fallout from last year's Higher Education and Research Act, the first major piece of reform to the sector in something like a quarter of a century. The Act has established a new regulator in the form of the Office for Students, which will be very soon in coming into operation next month. And that replaces the Higher Education Funding Council for England from April. Obviously, it has a remit that includes a focus on competition, student choice and outcomes, a risk-based approach to monitoring provider performance. It wants to focus on the promotion of increased choice and diversity and to make it quicker and easier for new providers to enter the market. Now, aside from Toby Young's questionable appointment and subsequent resignation from the OFS board recently, arguably the biggest controversy coming out of this is the claim that the OFS will effectively let certain providers go under if they no longer seem viable. And this is obviously a massive change in thought compared to the old HEFCA. And indeed the OFS has made it clear that they will not step in to save any failing universities, which obviously has a massive implication not just for current students but for former students as well. And I would know if I was attending the university of wherever that had gone under, knowing that my degree could effectively be worthless is obviously a massive concern to potentially hundreds of thousands of students of all ages. Now, whether or not the OFS would let this happen is difficult to say. And although the tough talk seems symptomatic of a current political discourse around higher education, the fact that they're willing to say this just goes to show how far the concept of a marketised higher education sector has developed in recent years. Now, this isn't the only concern. The OFS will have the power to levy hefty fines, the maximum equivalent to 2 or 5% of an institution's total qualifying income. So that's tuition fee revenue plus any other OFS grants that a university receives. Now, such fines could be levied for a variety of issues, whether that's issues around student outcomes, financial sustainability, governance, and again a recent issue in the headlines, the issue of free speech. But I think on a positive note, the OFS won't want to be seen as punitive, especially since any fines levy could have a direct impact on the quality of education delivered to students. But nevertheless, it does represent something of a wake-up call. In addition to the creation of the OFS, the HE and Research Act establishes UK research and innovation. Now, this aims to break down the barriers between the 7 existing research funding councils and combine them together along with Innovate UK and Research England, the latter taking on the knowledge exchange role currently delivered by HEFCA. Its main role is going to be to focus on improving innovation and better commercialising research within the sector. Again, key parts of the industrial strategy that we've already mentioned, but I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. In addition to these new bodies, the government have also announced its much awaited review of post-18 education, which will take place over the coming year. Now, this is already going to be chaired by the author and financier Philip Auger, but it is feared that it may already be somewhat of a damp squib, considering that any major review of student tuition funding has effectively been ruled out. It will, however, look at areas such as variable fees, 2-year degrees, maintenance grants, so I guess that's at least something. But either way, it does fall short of Labour's pledge to completely abolish tuition fees, even if such a policy would likely have quite a destabilising effect on the sector if it was implemented in a short space of time, and potentially risk narrowing rates of participation and social mobility, which in many respects has actually been quite a big success story across the sector in recent years. Oh, here we are. So as I already mentioned briefly, the industrial strategy, and really this is probably one of the other big areas that is affecting the sector. And universities and colleges are in many ways at its heart, and alongside further education colleges will form the cornerstones of local efforts to try and drive innovation and greater productivity. Central to the industrial strategy is the pledge that R&D investment will rise from its current rate of 1.7% of GDP to try and meet the OECD average of 2.4% by 2027. And UK Research and Innovation, as I already mentioned, which will also be set up next month alongside the OFS, they're going to see their budget rise by 20% in real terms by 2019-20. Furthermore, the Higher Education Innovation Fund will see a funding rise of around £250 million by 2020-21, and there will be extra funding for Innovate UK, the UK's innovation agency, which interestingly will be able to start funding grants again as opposed to just loans after several years of intense budgetary pressures. And I think one of the good things about the industrial strategy that I mentioned just ahead of moving on to Brexit, there will be some solace in the fact that a new international research and innovation strategy and a new £110 million fund for international collaboration has also been announced, along with £300 million over 3 years to try and attract and retain world-leading talent. And again, going back to headlines, it was only the last couple of days when we get another warning about a potential PhD brain drain from UK universities. So that will at least be some good news. Now, much like the other developments I've mentioned, that doesn't mean there aren't concerns. The white paper sets out 4 major grand challenges: AI, mobility, clean growth and an ageing society. And it also establishes sector deals, partnerships between government and industry aimed at increasing productivity, focused on the life sciences, construction, AI and the automotive sector. Now, in many ways, some of the concerns that I've heard is that these are areas the UK is already world leading. So maybe it would be better served for some of this money to be focused on other areas that perhaps we're not as world leading. And also the strong focus on commercialisation has been criticised for running the risk that other less fortunate sectors may well fall by the wayside, whether that's theoretical research that doesn't have any sort of immediate apparent commercial value, even if 10 years down the line that would be certainly not the case. And those outside the STEM subjects as well will also fear that they've been overlooked. Now, I'm talking as a Doctor of History, as a humanities graduate, and you know, I've heard all sorts of concerns of what about us? And you only have to listen to the recent debate over the value of arts and humanities subjects and the issue of variable fees to get a sense of that. So coming very much to the elephant in the room, Brexit. It's probably the area that in many ways offers the least clarity going forward. But what is clear is that with a declining number of school leavers across the next decade, international students will be an ever more valuable source of funding and a means of driving growth in years to come. Now, it was much feared that the referendum results would have an immediate negative impact on the number of students choosing to come to the UK. Now, in the short term, it appears these fears have been slightly exaggerated. And you'll see there from the UCAS figures that last year there was a dramatic surge in the number of applications from both inside and outside the EU after an initial decline immediately after the referendum result. However, there is obviously a big asterisk that needs to go next to this. And although this is encouraging, we need to consider that there are several short-term factors that are going to be influencing this figure. Most notably the rush by many EU students to try and get in before they lose the guarantee of home fee status after 2018-2019. And considering those coming from outside the EU, we also need to consider the Trump effect. And there's been a documented spike, for instance, in applications to UK universities from Mexican students, which is somewhat unsurprising considering Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric. And going back to research briefly, in terms of access to EU research funding, there's been very little clarity. At best we've had really is a leaked Home Office document that established the government has a desire to retain access to key EU research funding schemes. Very little detail on how it's actually going to do that, but obviously that's not really surprising. And obviously this will include the current Horizon 2020 and its eventual successor, Framework 9, as well as separate research linked to EU nuclear energy and space. Now, obviously this will be vital for the future success of the sector. Currently the UK receives around €1.3 billion euros per year in funding from the EU, and that's more than it pays in. So the commitment in the leaked paper at least does provide some hope that this vital funding stream won't dry up entirely, even if some form of associate access could end up costing just as much as we benefit. And as always, with many of these things, the devil will very much be in the detail. So everything I've touched upon so far really does lead to the question of whether the current higher education sector is more divided than it's ever been before. And I've included here a copy of some research from the last few years that we've done into universities' financial health and performance, here charted with the wealthy, well, the wealthiest essentially and most successful universities in terms of various performance metrics clustered on the top right. And just for instance, the size of the bubble corresponds to the size of IT spend, so you might be able to guess a few of them sort of clustered in various areas. Now, I think there's a real risk that all of this government reform and the new regulatory landscape could further reinforce the divide between the largely research-intensive universities in the top right and the rest. And the rest are essentially very much in the vanguard, bearing that important brunt of teaching the bulk of UK students and often doing amazing work despite the immense pressures that they're facing. I think we also risk furthering the divide between STEM and the arts and humanities. The government drive to focus on commercialisation, earnings, the economic benefits of certain degrees versus others, I think these have a real risk of deepening this divide. And it's when it comes to the issue of variable fees, it appears that students themselves have very little appetite for that. So recent research by HEPI has found that 63% back a single fee level for full-time undergraduate courses, and even then if pressed, around a half of students think that higher fees should only be for courses that cost more to teach, not those that lead to higher earnings. Now I'm aware I'm sort of pushing a little bit up against time, but I want to consider some of the ways that IT can help meet a lot of these challenges. The creation of the OFS has the potential to make it easier for new institutions to gain degree awarding powers and official university status. Now, any new entrants will be very keen to try and make use of the latest technology and pedagogies in order to differentiate themselves from the old guard. So this includes, for instance, areas I'm sure you're all familiar with, blended learning, integrating the elements of traditional classroom learning with digital resources, but also things like project-based learning, where seminars, lectures, lab work, very much the traditional form of higher education, is augmented by collaborative, self-directed and more problem-based approaches. And a good example of this would be NMITES, which is the new model in technology and engineering, which looks set to be the first publicly funded greenfield university for over 3 decades. And an institution that has plans to embrace the concept of project-based learning and blended learning, but also other areas such as automation, real-time assessments, and the idea of a state-of-the-art smart campus. Now, while new players such as NMITES will struggle to compete, at least initially, with larger, better established universities, there is the fear they could threaten smaller institutions that are heavily reliant on teaching, particularly those that are facing a student recruitment shortage. Another area that universities are beginning to think more about is MOOCs, or not so much MOOCs, but distance learning more generally. Now this is, as I mentioned, is going to be necessary to help stem the decline in part-time and mature student numbers in a jobs market where regular retraining and lifelong learning is becoming more commonplace. What we're seeing is that increasingly providers are moving away from free MOOCs and towards effectively monetized courses offering small micro-credentials that build up towards a recognised qualification. And I think it was a couple of days ago that the University of London has announced that it will be one of the first UK universities to offer a full bachelor's degree in this manner. I think using the US provider Coursera, one of the biggest in the country, or in the world I should say. So For universities, I think what many of them are looking to do is to try and adopt a bit of a hybrid model. So that's a mixture of free courses, which are very useful to help sell the experience of higher education to those considering it, but maybe don't want to have to put any money down, but want to just sort of dip their toe in the water. Alongside a mixture of paid courses that will help effectively contribute towards some recognised qualification. And I think this is going to be an important priority considering that UK universities have such a small share of the market at the moment. And it's a market that's going to grow rapidly. I mean, something like 36% by 2020. In the long term, technologies such as blockchain also has a big role to play here. Obviously, the technology underpinning cryptocurrencies, it really could alter the way that all qualifications across higher education are accredited. And, in this instance would be quite well suited to distance learning courses, although realistically this is probably quite a way off. Now, we've mentioned a little bit about data analytics today and the role of AI in education. Now, obviously, analytics themselves are nothing new for universities, but what really is new is the collation of several data sets, wide-ranging data sets, whether that be academic progress, results, attendance, the details on interaction with particular IT systems, library services, VLEs, to name but a few, and bringing these all into a single platform. Now, I don't really need to sell to you the benefits of learning analytics, but things like reducing dropout rates by identifying early signs of disengagement are probably one of the most commonly cited ones. But at the moment there are really only a handful of dedicated solutions in the market, and in fact many of the solutions are actually just repurposed commercial off-the-shelf business intelligence and custom in-house solutions with a wide scope of differing capabilities. Now, there will be some uniformity arising now that JISC's National Learning Analytics project is finished and a beta phase completed towards the end of last year, around September last year. Now this is hosted as an open multi-tenanted cloud-based solution, and so far around 50 universities and colleges have signed up. And this is quite exciting. This potentially, once it's developed, could offer the potential to embrace an area such as personalised learning. And I think personalised learning is really the holy grail of learning analytics in many ways. The ability to be able to leverage all the data that a university collects and use artificial intelligence to help provide students with a personalised pathway through a curriculum or a particular topic. Now, I won't say too much about research because I've touched on it already, but I will add that although increased research funding will allow smaller regional universities to pool their resources and enable them to procure high-performance computing facilities, this should help them chip away at some of the monopoly that the leading Russell Group universities have enjoyed when it comes to research. So 76%, £4.45 billion of research funding, which is concentrated at the top Russell Group universities. Again, I've mentioned briefly the rationalisation of back office and front office systems. I just want to say a little bit quickly about the cloud as well, because we've got some research recently, which I'm more than happy to talk about later, into cloud adoption in higher education. And what we have seen is a wider move for universities to try and procure cloud-based solutions in recent years, and what's encouraging the real growth of a cloud-first attitude. Now, I can't mention this without thanking you, Kaiser, for some of the data that they were able to share with us, and specifically Heidi Fraser-Krauss as well, because she shared some really interesting data from up in York, which was really integral to this. But in terms of forecast, we anticipate that spending on cloud will rise across the board. So obviously spending on SaaS will remain dominant, although spending on PaaS and IaaS will also remain relatively small, but will increase as well, with some quite significant growth in fact. Now, I just want to finish by another area that I briefly mentioned earlier, and that's the smart campus. The use of the Internet of Things to try and collect as much data as possible, which can then be leveraged by learning analytics and other solutions. Now, one of the best examples of this is up at the University of Glasgow with the £800 million transformation of 14 acres of the city's East End. And there are several solutions that are already or will be very soon in place. And this includes a sensor network monitoring occupancy rates in the university library, optimised timetabling utilising predictive analytics based on students' course choices, smart parking, which is always often the bane of life for many, both students and staff, 5G connectivity and sensors that even track footfall so they can get a good idea of how facilities are being used. And in many respects, they're quite unique. I mean, lots of universities are maybe toying with various areas of these, but none have been able to sort of bring these together. And I think obviously in the next few years with capital expenditure in universities increasing and the need to constantly try and invest in facilities, these are definitely going to be some of the areas that universities are going to be focusing on. So I was going to say a little bit about networking and communications, but I'm aware I'm probably running a little bit over in time-wise. So what I hope you can all take away from this then is that despite the various challenges that UK higher education is facing, I mean, IT is very much going to be in the vanguard of meeting these. And I don't want to sound too much like a doom monger sort of going on about challenges and not really offering a huge amount of solutions. But looking at just a few examples there, it's clear that you guys in the room have got a real clear idea of the role technology at least can play in meeting a lot of these. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for either Rob or David? No? Everybody's wanting to get off and have their drinks. I'd just like to ask one question, if that's okay. How do you see the transition with the introduction of apprenticeships coming in and changing some of that HE landscape as we look at how they're going to be incorporated into that whole student body?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think sort of, just to go on a sort of personal note for a second, I mean, it's interesting when I speak to some of my younger cousins, and they're very much the sort that you would have said, right, they're going to go to university, that's the sort of approach they would have taken. They're not doing that now, they're actually going for these apprenticeship options instead, mainly because of the issue with the size of the graduate debt. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's an area that the government has said a lot about bringing together universities, colleges and local businesses and bring them together as part of the industrial strategy. So that's obviously going to be a key area that they need to focus on. And so obviously apprentices have a potential role in working not just in universities, in sort of practical business learning and things like that. So yeah, it's obviously going to be key.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, this is one down here.
It's not so much a question, it's more bringing together two issues. You spoke about cybersecurity, and for universities that's a real challenge right now. But what we're seeing with apprenticeships too is that where we're engaging with commercial apprenticeships such as BT and others, they're actually asking institutions for certification that we may not have. So they're looking for those same high standards. They're looking for ISO 27001. They're looking for the right tick marks with regard to people strategies. So actually what we're seeing is a number of issues actually coming together and adding additional pressure to IT services, because we may not be at the standards that people now are looking for in order to protect themselves from the fines of GDPR.
Interesting point. Any other questions? No? In that case, can I thank you once again for a very interesting talk, and thank you for coming and joining us here at UCISA, and I hope you'll be around and join us for the drinks over in the exhibition hall. Thank you, colleagues.